September 10, 1986. A Manhattan hotel room, Midtown. A 31-year-old man gets down on one knee in front of a woman named Lega Look and asks her to marry him. She says yes. They sleep together that night for the first time. About a year and a week later, her gynecologist calls her in to deliver the result of a blood test, and what he tells her is that she has been infected with HIV. The man who proposed to her in that hotel room will be diagnosed with AIDS 90 days after that night. He will be dead before he turns 35. But here's the thing that nobody in NASCAR wanted to answer for the next 4 decades. The man who gave her that disease may have already known something was seriously wrong on the night he got down on that knee. He may have already suspected, and once he received the official diagnosis in December of 1986, he spent the following 20 months not calling a single one of the women he had been with to warn them. Not one phone call, not one message, and when Lega Look finally went public with her story in January of 1995, the women who called her from Charlotte alone numbered around 30. 30 women, from one city. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the darkest corners of NASCAR history, the stories the sport never really wanted told. If you're someone who wants to know the full truth about the legends you thought you already understood, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, most of you have probably heard some version of the Tim Richmond story. The 7 wins in 17 races during the second half of 1986. The Cleveland Clinic diagnosis. The Pocono comeback in June of 1987. The drug test at Daytona in February of 1988 that NASCAR botched so badly that Bill France Jr. admitted on tape, years later, that the test was not a good test. The plane trailing a banner over the speedway that read "Fans, I miss you." The $20 million lawsuit. The ESPN 30 for 30 in 2010. The death at 34. That story has a clean villain and a clean victim and a neat tragic shape, and most of it is true. But it is only the surface. The story underneath is messier, because in the story underneath Tim Richmond himself is part of the problem. And the people he hurt are not all sitting in boardrooms in Daytona Beach. Some of them died too. Some of them are still alive. And some of them are still anonymous, still waiting to be counted. Look, before we go any further, I want to say something clearly. Nothing you are about to hear erases what NASCAR did to this man. The drug test was fraudulent. The institutional response to his illness was shameful. The organization used his diagnosis as cover for its own misconduct, and that is documented. But the other story, the one that has been sitting in the public record for 30 years in the work of journalists like Liz Clark and Sandy Hill and Scott Fowler, has not made it into most of the tellings because it is the part the sport and the family had very specific reasons to keep buried. And the people who paid the real cost of Tim Richmond's last 3 years of life were not Tim Richmond alone. So let's go back to where this actually starts. Tim Richmond was born June 7, 1955, in Ashland, Ohio. His father Al was a welder who designed an auger boring machine that allowed pipe contractors to lay pipe under highways without trenching, built that invention into an export business called Richmond Manufacturing, and created real family wealth. Tim grew up with a Corvette before driving age and a Pontiac Trans Am with a bow on it for his 16th birthday. He got his pilot's license at 16. He attended Miami Military Academy because his parents recognized, and this part is genuinely poignant, that the kids at his local school resented the money. He did not race competitively until he was 21. By 25, he was Indianapolis 500 Rookie of the Year. By 27, he was driving stock cars on the invitation of team owner Joe Maioli. By 28, he had landed at the Raymond Beatles Blue Max team, where he would spend 3 years from 1983 through 1985, building a driving reputation that was extraordinary and a personal reputation that was something else entirely. Here's what most people don't realize about those Blue Max years. That is where the lifestyle that would eventually kill him took its shape. And it was not exactly hidden. Steve Wade, who covered NASCAR for Winston Cup Scene magazine, described the Beatles' operation as not known as a docile bunch, and said that with his looks and his personality, Richmond was not the milk and cookies watch television type. Understand that is the polite version of what Wade was saying. The clothes were Armani suits and silk shirts. The accessories were snakeskin boots and a Rolex. He had a Manhattan apartment, a house on Lake Norman in North Carolina, a condo in Deerfield Beach, Florida, and a Chris Craft houseboat docked at the Baja Marina in Fort Lauderdale. Jimmy Johnson, the general manager of the Fuelers team at Hendrick Motorsports, told journalist Liz Clark that he first met Richmond at about 10 in the morning in November of 1985 at that Fort Lauderdale slip. Richmond was sitting on top of the boat in a tiny bathing suit with a champagne bottle full of imported beer and a whole plate of crab legs beside him. 10 in the morning. That image is the one to hold. And it only gets darker from here. In 1986, AIDS wasn't Magic Johnson. There was no AZT yet. If your doctor told you that you had AIDS, what it meant in practical terms was that you had somewhere between a few months and a few years, and there was nothing anyone on earth could do about it. Magic Johnson's announcement was still 5 years away. The cultural reference point for AIDS in 1986 was Rock Hudson dying in 1985. It was Ryan White, a 13-year-old hemophiliac in Kokomo, Indiana, being thrown out of his middle school by parents who were terrified their children would catch it from him. It was the disease the country had been told, loudly and repeatedly, for about 4 years by then, was a gay disease and a drug user disease and a Haitian immigrant disease. The CDC had only confirmed a few years earlier that heterosexual transmission was possible, and that information had not filtered down to most of the country in any meaningful way yet. AZT, the first antiretroviral drug, would not receive FDA approval until March 19, 1987. So if you were a 31-year-old white guy from Ashland, Ohio, sitting in a doctor's office in late 1986, and the doctor told you that you had AIDS, here is what that meant. You were going to die. You were going to die soon. There was no treatment. There was no timeline you could plan around. And the stigma attached to the diagnosis was so crushing, so total, that grown adults in every part of American life would lie about it to their dying day rather than admit what they had. That is the world Tim Richmond walked into when he flew to Cleveland under the alias Lee Warner on December 10, 1986, and received his diagnosis at the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so he got a death sentence in December of 1986, and the situation after that is understandable in context. And look, some of it genuinely is. But here's the thing that the December diagnosis story leaves out. There is a paper trail of Tim Richmond being visibly, demonstrably sick months before that December flight. And the most important witness on this question is a man named Harry Hyde. Harry Hyde was 60 years old in 1986. He had been building race cars since before most of the Hendrick crew was born. He was, by any measure, one of the most experienced and sharp-eyed crew chiefs in the history of the sport. And he told journalist Liz Clark that he first noticed something was seriously wrong with Tim Richmond around the time of the Southern 500 at Darlington. That race was on August 31, 1986. He gave even more detail to Winston Cup Scene magazine. His exact words were these. His eyes were watering and his nose was running. He was taking antibiotics. If a doctor told him to take 2 at a time, he would take 4 or 5. Hyde went back to Darlington 1986 as the moment he could put his finger on and said, plainly, he was a sick man then. Darlington was August 31st. The hotel room in Manhattan, where Tim Richmond got down on one knee in front of Lega Look, was September 10th. 10 days apart. The crew chief had already seen Richmond visibly ill, aggressively self-medicating with antibiotics, behaving like a man who understood at some level that something was going wrong in his body, and then 10 days later Richmond flew to New York and proposed marriage and slept with a woman without telling her there was anything to be concerned about. This is where it gets really interesting, and by interesting I mean genuinely difficult to sit with. Because there is one more layer of evidence here that the standard telling almost always skips. After that night in Manhattan, Tim Richmond essentially vanished from Lega Look's life. She had moved to Los Angeles for her acting career. She was expecting him to fly out. He never came. The day before Thanksgiving, she sat in her apartment waiting for him to arrive. He did not show up. He did not call. He did not return a single one of the messages she left at his parents' house in Ashland, Ohio. She left repeated messages with his father Al and his mother Evelyn through the rest of 1986 and into 1987. Not one message was ever returned. That is not the behavior of a man who has nothing to worry about. That is not inattention or carelessness or the flightiness of a celebrity who had moved on to the next thing. That is the behavior of a man who knows, at minimum suspects, that something is very wrong, and who has made the decision, consciously or not, to disappear rather than have a conversation he does not know how to have. 3 days before Richmond himself flew to Cleveland for his official diagnosis, a sports publicity agent in California had already called Lega Look in Los Angeles to ask her if she had heard that Tim was in a hospital with AIDS. The grapevine in NASCAR was already running. The grapevine was running before Tim Richmond had an official diagnosis to hide. Here's what most people don't realize about that timeline. The question of whether Richmond knew on September 10th is the wrong question. The better question is what he suspected, what the people around him had already noticed, and what he chose to do with that information before and after the December diagnosis made it impossible to pretend anymore. And the answer to that question, across every piece of the available record, points in one direction. Humpy Wheeler, who ran Charlotte Motor Speedway and had known Richmond for years, saw him at the NASCAR Awards banquet on December 5, 5 days before the Cleveland flight, and told reporters later that he could tell it was something worse than stress. Wheeler said Richmond was extremely disturbed about what he looked like by then. December 5, December 10. The awards banquet, the alias, the coma, the death. It is all moving in one direction from the moment Harry Hyde looked at him at Darlington. 7 wins in 17 races. That stretch in 1986 is one of the most remarkable runs in NASCAR history. But those same 17 races were happening while Tim Richmond was already sick. Let's talk about what that 1986 season actually looked like, because understanding the racing helps you understand everything else. Richmond had moved to Hendrick Motorsports for the 1986 season, driving the number 25 car. Rick Hendrick was already building what would become the most dominant organization in the history of the sport, and he had taken a calculated risk on a driver whose talent was undeniable and whose personal life was, to put it charitably, complicated. The results on the track justified everything. Richmond won at Pocono in June. He won at Riverside. He won at Michigan. He won at Pocono again. He won at Watkins Glen. He won at Pocono a third time. He won at Richmond International Raceway. 7 wins in the second half of the season, in 17 starts, at a pace that had the garage talking about what he might do in a full healthy season in 1987. Here's the thing about that word healthy. Because Harry Hyde was already watching him at Darlington in late August, noticing the watering eyes and the antibiotics, and Richmond was still winning races. That tells you 2 things simultaneously. It tells you how extraordinary the talent was, that a man who was already symptomatic with a disease that was going to kill him within 3 years could still go out on a Sunday afternoon and outrun the best stock car drivers in the world. And it tells you how easy it was for the people around him to explain away what they were seeing, because when a man is winning races, you find reasons to believe that whatever looks wrong is probably nothing serious. The Blue Max years before Hendrick are where the story underneath the story actually lives, and we have to go back there for a minute because that is where the pattern was established. Those years, 1983 through 1985, are where the lifestyle that would eventually become lethal took its full shape. And the most blunt on-the-record statement about what that lifestyle actually included comes from Jimmy Johnson, the Fuelers team general manager at Hendrick, the same man who described the 10 in the morning champagne bottle and crab legs seen at the Fort Lauderdale Marina. Johnson sat down with author Peter Golenbach for a book called American Zoom that came out in 1994, and in that interview he was less polite than he had been with Liz Clark. What he told Golenbach was that Tim liked horse. Those were his words. He said Richmond's own mother Evelyn would acknowledge it. He repeated it more than once. Now, you might be thinking, okay, one source, maybe that gets dismissed. But here's the thing. That statement has been sitting in print for over 30 years. It was published in a book with named sources, and most documentary tellings of the Tim Richmond story have simply elected not to mention it, not to challenge it, not to address it, just to not mention it. And the reason it matters is not to damage Tim Richmond's legacy further. It matters because it is part of the epidemiological picture of how a 31-year-old white male stock car driver from Ashland, Ohio ended up HIV positive in an era when the public messaging around the disease was almost entirely focused on gay men and intravenous drug users. The drugs question is where the record gets thinner, and it gets thinner because the people who would know chose not to go on the record. Richard Petty told Liz Clark that there was a question in his mind about drugs and that he had always wondered whether Richmond was, his exact phrasing, pumped up when he was driving that race car, and whether he was or whether he was not. Petty said he would always question it. Most of the people in the garage who saw Richmond up close told some version of the same story. They never saw the drugs directly, but they suspected the drugs consistently. That distinction, never saw but always suspected, runs through almost every account from people who were actually there. The most concrete piece of evidence on the drugs question is the intervention. In early 1988, right around the time of the Daytona drug test chaos, Rick Hendrick and stunt director Hal Needham and a U.S. Tobacco Motorsports executive named Johnny Hayes staged an intervention. Needham described it later. He said he baited Richmond by telling him there was a U.S. Tobacco ride waiting for him. Richmond genuinely believed he was coming in to talk about a race car. Then they dropped it on him. They thought he was on cocaine. They were trying to get him into rehab. He refused. That intervention is documented. The people involved have gone on the record. And it tells you something important about how the people closest to him understood what was happening, even if none of them were willing to say it in depositions. Liz Clark's careful sentence in her 1994 piece is the one to hold on to here. She wrote that most friends say they never saw drugs around him, and others say he never used needle drugs. Read that sentence both ways. Both readings are probably true simultaneously. The drugs were present. The eyewitnesses, the kind who would testify to specifics in court or on the record, are not there. And so the drugs question lives in the same space as a lot of the Tim Richmond story, documented enough to take seriously, ambiguous enough that no one has been forced to resolve it publicly. What is not ambiguous is the documentation of his contact with women. Plural. Many women. Over many years. In many cities. This is not gossip or rumor. This is documented, named, corroborated by independent sources, and it is the part of the story that carries the heaviest weight. Because those women did not just become uncomfortable statistics after December 1986. Several of them became sick. At least one of them died. And the count, the actual total count of how many people Tim Richmond's disease reached before and after his diagnosis, is a number nobody in NASCAR has ever had the appetite to add up in public. Debbie Putman was engaged when she got her diagnosis. Her fiancé tested negative. Her published obituary did not mention AIDS. In 1992 in North Carolina, you did not put that in an obituary if you could help it. We know about Debbie Putman specifically because her grandmother Julia Stafford and her mother Betty Putman talked to the Miami Herald in 1996, a few years after Debbie died of AIDS at approximately 35 years old. The grandmother told the Herald that before Debbie died, She had confided that she remembered going to a party at Tim's place, and that was where she must have gotten it, because the two of them had been together. That is the grandmother's account. That is what Debbie told her before she died. And her fiancé, the man she had planned to marry, tested negative. Which means the transmission had happened before that relationship. Which means Debbie Putman got sick and died, and her obituary was written around the cause of death, because that was what you did in 1992 in North Carolina if you had any choice in the matter. The Miami Herald, in that same 1996 piece, reported that at least 2 other former partners of Tim Richmond were in seclusion on the East Coast, dying of AIDS. The Herald did not name them. As best the available record reveals, they have never been named publicly. They are part of the count that nobody has been willing to finalize. Now, here's the thing about Lega Look's story specifically, because her story is the one we know most completely, and it deserves to be told in full rather than summarized. Lega Look was not a casual encounter. She was not a one-night situation from a random race weekend. She had known Tim Richmond for approximately 6 years by September of 1986. She was a former Miss World 600, which is the beauty pageant associated with the Coca-Cola 600 at Charlotte Motor Speedway. She was a Wilhelmina model. She was an actress with film credits behind her and a career in Charlotte ahead of her. She was someone he knew well enough to propose marriage to, which means she was someone he knew well enough to have had a different conversation with if he had chosen to. She moved to Los Angeles for her acting career. She was waiting for him to visit. He never came. She left messages that were never returned. And then, about a year and a week after that hotel room in Manhattan, her gynecologist called her in to deliver the result of a blood test. And what the gynecologist told her was that she had been infected with HIV. Look, I want you to sit with what that moment actually means. She is in a doctor's office in the mid-80s being told she has a disease that the country understands as a death sentence for gay men and drug addicts. She is a straight woman. She is a former beauty queen and a model and an actress. She has done nothing that the public health messaging of her era told her to be afraid of. And she is sitting there with a diagnosis that she cannot tell anyone about because the stigma in 1987 is so total that disclosure would functionally end her career, her social life, and her ability to move through the world without being treated as a pariah. She does not even know yet whether the man who gave it to her knew what he was carrying. What happened to her over the following years, before she went public in January of 1995, is the part of this story that the standard tellings reduce to a brief sad paragraph and then move past. She spent approximately 2 years, by her own account to reporters, sitting in front of knives and thinking about driving one of them into her heart. Those are her words. Not a metaphor. Not an exaggeration for effect. She was diagnosed, isolated, silent, and suicidal for a sustained period of years while the sport she had been connected to mourned the man who had given her the disease and presented him as the victim of an unjust institution. She told a Knight Ridder reporter in 1995 that she would sit in front of the television and cry, not because people were grieving for Tim, but because no one was grieving for her, and she was dying in silence. Here's what most people don't realize about her survival. The combination antiretroviral therapy that eventually brought her viral load to undetectable levels did not exist in the years immediately following her diagnosis. AZT, which was approved in March of 1987, was a single drug with significant toxicity and limited effectiveness on its own. The combination therapy that transformed HIV from a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition did not become widely available until the mid-90s. Which means Lega Look spent approximately a decade living with a diagnosis that carried a realistic expectation of death before the treatment landscape changed enough to make her long-term survival genuinely possible. The 2008 update on her in the Charlotte Observer placed her at 47 years old, still alive, viral load undetectable on combination antiretroviral therapy, living in Indian Trail, North Carolina, dealing with diabetes as a medication side effect, but alive. She had outlived Tim Richmond by nearly 20 years by then. The man who helped her survive was not a doctor. He was a fellow actor in Los Angeles named Danny Green. He became her best friend through the diagnosis. He tested negative. He stayed with her anyway. They married on Valentine's Day in 1996, months after she went public. He has been with her since. Now here is the number that everything else in this story has to be understood in relation to. After Lega Look went public in January of 1995, she said that women from Charlotte alone called her in such numbers that she could have started a support group of approximately 30 of them. 30 women. From Charlotte. From one city. Women who had slept with Tim Richmond and who were now, years after his death, worried they had been infected. And this is not only her claim. Dr. David Dodson, Tim Richmond's own infectious disease specialist in West Palm Beach, told the Miami Herald in 1996 that he himself had received several calls from women around the country in the months and years following Richmond's death. Two independent sources. The victim and the dying man's own physician. Confirming the same reality from two different directions. The Watkins Glen weekend in August of 1987 is the one almost nobody tells, because what happened on that Saturday night, and what happened the next morning at the drivers' meeting, came within a rainstorm of becoming the most public scandal in NASCAR history. Let's set the scene. By August of 1987, Tim Richmond had already made his comeback. He had come back to race on June 14 at Pocono and won. He had come back the following week at Riverside on Father's Day and won again, dedicating that win to his father Al. Those two wins are the closing chapter of his racing legend, and they are genuinely extraordinary. A man who had spent the winter at the Cleveland Clinic, who had lost 23 pounds, who had started AZT as soon as it became available in the spring, came back to a NASCAR Cup race and won. Twice. In consecutive weeks. That is the Tim Richmond that the sport wants to remember, and there is nothing wrong with remembering it, because it happened and it was remarkable. But from those two wins in June through the Michigan race in August, the deterioration accelerated in a way that the people around him could no longer explain away. And the Watkins Glen weekend is where the explaining away stopped being possible. Saturday, August 8, 1987. The night before the race. It was also Tom Higgins's 50th birthday. Higgins was the lead NASCAR writer at the Charlotte Observer, one of the most respected journalists covering the sport. A group of racing writers, including Steve Wade of Winston Cup Scene magazine, went out to a well-known Italian restaurant in Corning, New York to celebrate. They walked in and there was Tim Richmond at a table with friends. He was slumping in his seat. He was mumbling. Wade described what he saw as directly as anyone has put it in print. He said Richmond was clearly inebriated. Now understand what that means in context. Racing was a business that professional drivers took with absolute seriousness. Being visibly, publicly drunk at a restaurant in the race town the Saturday night before a Sunday race was not a personal failing that people in the garage looked past. It was a serious professional infraction. It was the kind of thing that got noticed and remembered and talked about. The next morning at the drivers' meeting, Richmond showed up very late. He appeared hungover and confused. And as the meeting broke up, something happened that has almost never made it into the standard tellings of this story. Several of the top stars in the garage, and we are talking about the biggest names in the sport at that moment, approached the Cup Series director Dick Beattie and delivered a unanimous message. If Richmond runs, we will not. A threatened driver mutiny. At a Cup race. On national television. Here's the thing that prevented that from happening on camera in front of the country. Rain. Rain postponed the race by a day, which gave the situation time to de-escalate before it became the kind of story that ends careers and changes institutions. But the meeting happened. The threat happened. The garage by August of 1987 had collectively decided it had seen enough. One more week. Michigan. August 16, 1987. This is the last race of Tim Richmond's career, and the way it unfolded is documented in enough detail that there is no ambiguity about what was happening. By this point, Richmond cannot reliably be where he is supposed to be at the time he is supposed to be there. Harry Hyde had to go physically find him before time trials closed. When Hyde found him, Richmond was disoriented and groggy. He qualified 25th. And here is the detail that Evelyn Richmond would later try to explain away with a story about a jammed trailer door. He had to be transported from the hauler to his car by golf cart because he could not make the walk under his own power. Evelyn's version was that the door on the trailer had jammed and Tim had 5 minutes to get to his car, so the golf cart was a practical solution. She said he was sick in the truck and never should have run that race. And look, that last part is almost certainly true. He never should have run that race. But the trailer door story does not square with the broader pattern of the entire weekend, the entire month, the entire summer. Les Richter, the NASCAR competition director, called Rick Hendrick after Michigan, and the message from Richter was simple and direct. Your driver does not look in any shape to drive a race car. Richmond finished 29th at Michigan with a blown engine. He resigned from Hendrick Motorsports in September of 1987. He was 22 months away from dying. Now, this is where it gets really interesting in terms of what happened next, because what happened next is the part of the story that has received the most attention, and it is genuinely important, but it has also functioned as a kind of smokescreen that let the sport focus its outrage in one direction while the more complicated moral reckoning stayed buried. NASCAR ran a drug testing program at Daytona in February of 1988. Richmond submitted to testing. The first test result came back clean. NASCAR announced he had tested positive anyway. A second test from a different laboratory also came back clean. NASCAR then demanded his Cleveland Clinic medical record. He refused, and he filed a $20 million defamation lawsuit instead. Here's what most people don't realize about the drug test mess. The doctor who ran the laboratory that produced the false positive on Richmond at Daytona was a man named Forrest Tennant, who was simultaneously serving as the National Football League's drug advisor. 2 days after a Washington television station broadcast its investigation into the Richmond test in February of 1990, Tennant abruptly resigned from his NFL position. The Washington Post reported that sources told them he had been forced out. The sealed settlement on Richmond's lawsuit against NASCAR is still sealed today. The Cleveland Clinic medical records are still protected today. And Bill France Jr., the man who ran NASCAR through all of it, made the closest thing the sport has ever produced to an admission in a 2006 interview that aired in the ESPN 30 for 30 documentary in 2010. France said, on tape, that the test was not a good test and that they did not know that at the time. France died at his Daytona Beach home on June 4, 2007, of cancer, at the age of 74. The admission died with him in the sense that no institutional accountability followed it. The deposition happened in October of 1988 in Charlotte. The lawyers asked Tim Richmond his name, his address. Then they asked him where he had gone to grade school, and he could not answer. The lawyers postponed the deposition. Before Richmond left the room, he signed an autograph for the court reporter's son. That detail is the one that stays with you. The man who could not remember where he went to grade school still understood, at some level, that there was a kid in the room who wanted his signature. And he signed it. That is the last documented public act of Tim Richmond that carries any of the personality the sport had loved. Everything after is the disease finishing its work. AIDS dementia complex was a well-documented late-stage presentation of AIDS in the 1980s. It is caused by the HIV virus directly infecting cells in the brain and central nervous system, and it produces exactly the symptoms Richmond was displaying by late 1988. Disorientation, memory gaps, inability to track conversations, slurred speech. The cognitive decline was not a side effect of anything else. It was the disease itself, moving into the final phase. Lega Lookabill described what it was like to talk to him by phone in those final months. He would call her at 4 in the morning. His speech was slurred. The conversations did not track. She said later it was like talking to someone in the Twilight Zone. He told her things he could not have meant and remembered things that had not happened. And she was on the other end of the line trying to figure out whether the man she had loved was still in there somewhere, while simultaneously living with the disease he had given her nearly 3 years earlier. The public story of Richmond's final hospitalization was a motorcycle accident. The cover story was put out by Dr. Jerry Punch, who was the ESPN pit reporter and a practicing physician, and who had been one of the very few people in NASCAR that Richmond had trusted with his actual diagnosis from the beginning. The Charlotte Observer first reported the hospitalization on May 24, 1989. The Los Angeles Times picked it up on May 26 and 27. Punch publicly attributed the admission to a motorcycle accident. Here's the thing about that story. No Florida Highway Patrol report has ever surfaced documenting it. No Palm Beach County Sheriff report has ever surfaced documenting it. And as the Wikipedia entry on Richmond now flatly concludes, it is unlikely Richmond had the physical strength to ride a motorcycle during his last months. The cover story was almost certainly a cover story. Punch was protecting his friend. He had been protecting his friend for 2.5 years by then. The actual reason for the May 24 admission was very probably a recurrence of pneumocystis pneumonia and an acute neurological event. What Richmond went through inside Good Samaritan Hospital over those final 81 days is mostly not recorded because the family did not want it recorded. Rick Hendricks stayed in contact and came when Richmond had good days. Hendricks' description of that period is quietly devastating. He said that if Tim had a good day, he could see people, and if he had a bad day, he could not. Most of the garage stayed away. The reasons were fear and ignorance and the discomfort of a sport that had never been required to deal with anything like this and had no framework for doing so. Lega Look talked to him by phone in those final months too. She had not heard from him in nearly 3 years until the calls started coming. Most of them were unintelligible. One of them was not. She told him she knew he had given her the disease. She told him she knew he had known something was wrong when he asked her to marry him. And then she told him she forgave him. He said thank you, in what she later described as a voice that sounded like a 4-year-old. 2 weeks later he was dead. The death happened at 5:12 in the morning on Sunday, August 13, 1989. He had been in a coma for some number of days. His parents Al and Evelyn were at the bedside. Jimmy Johnson, the Fuelers team manager, got the news that morning, opened his wall calendar, and wrote down that Tim died at 5:12 a.m. He has written that same note on the August 13th page of every desk calendar he has bought every January since. The official cause of death entered on the death certificate was cardiopulmonary arrest, with gastrointestinal hemorrhaging and AIDS listed as contributing and underlying causes. He was 34 years old. 10 days after the death, Dr. David Dodson held a press conference at Good Samaritan on behalf of the family. The statement he read included 3 specific denials. He absolutely did not get AIDS from intravenous drug use, homosexual activity, or a blood transfusion. And then Dodson said, on the record, that Richmond had refrained from sex after his diagnosis, but that the doctor could not say whether Richmond's previous partners had been informed of his infection. That last sentence is the one the standard tellings have skipped past for 35 years. The doctor was not vouching for Richmond's behavior before December 1986. The doctor was admitting, at the press conference announcing the cause of death, that the man's prior partners had not been warned. He did not have to use those exact words. That is what he was saying. Here's what most people don't realize about where this story actually ends. It does not end with the funeral in Ashland, Ohio, where the funeral home charged the family an extra $100 to handle the body once they learned the cause of death. It does not end with the sealed lawsuit or the protected medical records or the banner over Daytona. It ends with 30 women calling Lega Look from Charlotte alone in the mid-90s, trying to figure out if they needed to get tested. It ends with Debbie Putman's grandmother sitting with the Miami Herald telling them what Debbie had confided before she died. It ends with two unnamed women in seclusion on the East Coast, whose names have never appeared in print. It ends with the number nobody has ever had the appetite to count. Tim Richmond was the most naturally talented stock car driver of his generation. That is real. The institutional cruelty NASCAR directed at him in his final 18 months is real and documented and genuinely shameful. And the man at the center of it was also someone who carried a disease for somewhere around a decade, who slept with an unknowable number of women across the years he ran the circuit, who proposed marriage to one of them 10 days after his crew chief noticed he was visibly sick, who never returned her phone calls afterward, and who spent the 20 months between his December 1986 diagnosis and his cognitive collapse not making the calls that might have given the women in his life a fighting chance. Lega Lookabill is still alive in North Carolina. She forgave him before he died. He thanked her with a voice like a 4-year-old. That exchange is the last conversation anyone outside that hospital had with him that he was able to participate in. The sport has had 37 years to reckon with the full shape of what his life meant, and the institutional response has been to tell the parts that make NASCAR look bad and leave the rest in the drawer. The number Dr. Dodson confirmed to the Miami Herald was several. The number Lega Look gave was 30 from Charlotte alone. The number nobody knows is the total across all the cities and all the years and all the women who picked up the phone in the mid-90s and tried to find out if the man they had been with had left something behind that was still inside them. He died at 5:12 in the morning. His parents were in the room. The plane has long since landed. And the people he could not bring himself to call went on living with the question he left unanswered for as long as they had left to live with it.